Hi everyone, welcome. I can't see you, but I trust that you're there in the ethers and in your homes or wherever you may be tuning in from. Welcome to our first public event as Sun House. Sun House is a new film company, and if you've heard AJ speak before, you've probably heard his mantra about Black cinema. And so Sun House is dedicated to creating a Black cinema that's calibrated to the cultural, socioeconomic, and existential particulars of Black being, both in form and in content. A cinema as seductive as Black music, as profitable as Black music, and as sustainable as Black music. Today, we have a special series, round one of two conversations that will be happening this weekend about Black art and the revolution, as curator Thomas Lax put it. And I love that phrasing. These roundtables are held on the occasion of the streaming of Love is the Message is Death by 13 institutions worldwide. Thank you to the Smithsonian American Art Museum and to the Hirshhorn for starting and leading this initiative, and to everybody else who participated and everyone who agreed to let Love is the Message stream online for free so that it can really reach a broader audience, which fundamentally changes the nature of the work and its circulation. And a heartfelt thank you to everybody who agreed to be on the panel and for everybody who worked so hard to make this happen so quickly, especially to the folks at Osk Studio who built this beautiful website and to the developers that they work with. So today we have a panel of amazing thinkers and writers and artists and curators. So first off, we have Peter L'Official, who is an assistant professor of literature at Bard College and the author of Urban Legends, The South Bronx in Representation and Ruin, forthcoming next month, so July 2020, from Harvard University Press. And we also have Josh Begley, who's an artist and filmmaker based in Brooklyn, New York. He's a creator of Metadata, an iPhone app that tracks US drone strikes. And his work has appeared at the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Met Breuer, the New York Film Festival, and the Museum of Modern Art. Eliza Kelly is a PhD candidate at Columbia University. Her dissertation is about how art and literature document Black spatial and geographic practice. Thomas Lax is the curator of media and performance art at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Previously, he worked at the Studio Museum in Harlem for 7 years, and Thomas is on the board of Dance Space Project and teaches at Wesleyan University. Tina Kampt is the Owen F. Walker Professor of Humanities and Modern Culture and Media at Brown University. Kampt is a Black feminist theorist of visual culture and contemporary art. She's the author of 3 books, Other Germans, Black Germans and the Politics of Race, Gender and Memory in the Third Reich, Image Matters, Archive, Photography, and the African Diaspora in Europe, and Listening to Images. Her forthcoming book, A Black Gaze, will be published by MIT Press in 2021. Tina is going to be the moderator of today's panel. So without further ado, I'm going to disappear and have our esteemed panelists come on.
Do you want me to take it on? Okay. It's sad to see Aseel go. I want to thank her to begin with, because she's put in so much work to actually make this happen. And to all those brilliant technological geniuses who are on the other side of this Zoom or YouTube or Sun House, thank you for making it possible. As Atil said, this is one of 2 panels that's being organized by Sun House to both celebrate and to reflect on the occasion of the 48-hour public screening of Love is the Message is Death. Clearly, for us to be here right now, it is not an understatement to say that Love is the Message has had a profound impact on those who have seen it. And it's continuing to have a profound impact. And I'm thrilled that it's finally being shown on a public level like it is right now. So the 2 important things to say. On the one hand, it's really significant to be celebrating and reflecting on a film that has had this wide an impact and the vehicle for that impact has been the art world. The fact of the matter is that up until now, Love is a Message has been seen by most people in the context of galleries, exhibitions, film festivals, right? So it is deeply significant to be able to reflect on that, and to be able to have the opportunity to do that, because that's one of the things that AJ was very clear about, is this public screening is not supposed to happen without context, right? It is not supposed to be put into the world as an object. That it has always been something that's been intended to spark conversation. And this is a really important moment to spark those and to have those conversations. It's a moment when, in many ways, the images and the themes outlined in Love is the Message are being lived out in a completely visceral and profound way right in front of our eyes right now, every day, actually. And it's also a moment when we are having a nationwide conversation about not simply the acts of police violence and terror that are happening to Black people, but we're having a more profound conversation about anti-Blackness. And what does that mean? So this, as I've told my fellow panelists, this is intended as a conversation and discussion, not a series of necessarily statements, but really to try and engage each other and to think with Love is the Message as our vehicle for thinking about some of these themes. So I want us to really talk about these two things. So I'm going to start out with one sort of opening question prompt. And it's something that I've been thinking about on the occasion of this public screening, which is thinking back to the first time I saw Love is the Message in 2016. And I remember that moment, and I saw it on a small screen, and I remember trying to get closer and closer to the screen. Like I couldn't get close enough to it. And that I needed it to sort of surround me. I needed to have some kind of contact, right, with the images and the sound and everything else that was going on. And so I've been reflecting on that in relationship to what does it mean to see it now, right? Again, on a small screen, but under very, very different circumstances. And so I want to start by asking you to reflect on that, reflect on the then and the now of Love is the Message. What struck you about seeing it the first time? What strikes you about seeing it now? And I'd just love to have anybody, just jump in wherever you want to.
I mean, I can go.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that question, and thank you to Athil. I don't know if she's still listening. And thanks to AJ for bringing us all together too. So I think to your question, in some ways, it's almost frustrating to see it again because, it's like part of why AJ's work is so prophetic is that, he's a student of history. He's an archivist, he's a collector, right? And so by that, I mean, not much has changed, I think, right? I think, we're still being killed by the state on camera during a global pandemic, no less. We're still, I think, being failed by like visions of liberal humanism. I think we're still like in a kind of slow death of environmental degradation and settler colonialism and capitalism, right? And all of these things that we already know. And to see work like AJ's so brilliantly kind of place the terror and the beauty and the genius, right? On full display, and to see nothing change, right? And to sort of have it taken up by major institutions and have it taken up by, by white people and by people with money and people with power, and to still feel like, structurally things look the same, I think is really difficult. But I think it's also really illuminating. I think it's a reminder that like those institutions and those people are not the source of our liberation, and that we are the source, right? And that our liberation is something that we take and we make. And I think that Love is a Message really is like an archive of that in so many ways. That's what constitutes it, right? Are all these kind of like Black fugitive art making and life making practices that happen outside of and sometimes against institutions. And so, I think that's a really interesting thing to sit with. I think also having to sit with this particular type of viewing, and the kind of the ways in which like this is almost a literal liberation of the film itself from the private enclosures, from the status of private property. I think that's like a weird but interesting thing to think about is it's not a painting, it's a film, right? Its form is uniquely suited to the commons, to the people, right? To circulation. I think the film bears the traces of circulation and of sociality, and it's from the people, right? So to think about that transition, what it means now for it to be out in the world in a different kind of way, it makes me fantasize about like what else we can liberate from the bondage of private property and what else we have already in the last few weeks, quite literally. So those are some of the things that I'm sitting with as I'm watching it this time.
Thanks. I mean, one of the themes that you brought up, I think is really important, the continuities, right? The disturbing continuities between then and now. And that's the archival dimensions of it are about repetition, right? What repeats. And at the same time, I mean, I know this about AJ's work as well, and about AJ as a student of somebody like James Sneed, who teaches us that, that repetition in Black culture is not to replicate something. It's about, right, to make it anew. It's about these cycles of return where you come back and you start differently. And there's a way in which I also feel that Love's Message is doing that too. It's taking us through cycles and showing us how Black people emerge from those cycles, right, over and over again, and go to a different place, right, and start anew. Yeah.
Absolutely. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Tina and Eliza, with what you both said, and I'm just really happy to be here with all four of you, and thank you to Theo and AJ for bringing us together. I think that idea of repetition with difference is important both for the forms of enclosure that have awaited us and that, the state is preparing right now to recalibrate, but also the forms of perpetual revolution that structure Black life in this place, and the different types of strategies and social technologies that we come together to be able to create what is a new kind of definition of freedom in our own terms. One kind of invocation that Thelma Golden, the director and chief curator of the Student Museum, one of the 13 museums that is currently screening this work, and the kind of, and I want to really get back to what Eliza, you were saying about the kind of anti-capitalist, anti-commodification ways in which this screening itself is modeling for us a way out of some of some of our own boundaries in this moment. But one thing that Thelma Golden described this work as is a sacred text, and a sacred text to me at once is a kind of invocation of the power of belief that Black people have had, something I know that has been important to AJ, in all of his work, the way in which faith and religious structure is a way out of no way, to use a quote from another one of his films. But I think the other thing about this idea of a sacred text is that a sacred text is something that to which you return, right? You read it on your own, late at night, early in the morning, you come in together with community, you assemble around it, and it prepares you for a moment when the world as you know it will end and begin again. And I think that kind of rehearsal for, through assembly, through these kinds of invocations is what this work is doing. And the other thing that feels really important to me about Love is a Message, something that AJ has said about his work in general, which is that his work is unfinished, that, as he's determining the kind of structure, the compositional structure for a work, he is leaving something open to continue the actual form in which he's working. And I think that I totally agree, Lisa, that the way in which film in particular allows our viewing to be part of the structure of the work that he's made is so foundational to its possibility and potential, and it's also so much it's kind of part of its ensnarement that we are called by the video footage and images that we see in this work, that we see after the murder of George Floyd, to participate or refuse the thing that we are looking at. And in that way, there's no kind of version of passive looking. Any kind of grappling or reckoning or just of listening, bearing witness to this work is itself a form of participation. And so as we are in this conversation, the question then becomes, how do we respond to that call with another call? And I'm excited to be doing that with this group.
I love.
Oh, sorry.
Peter.
Oh, sorry. I also want to thank Josh for letting me go. I apologize, but I also want to thank Athil for organizing everything, and Tina for agreeing to moderate, and Elisa for getting us started. And lastly, I want to thank Thomas for mentioning a sacred text, the idea of a sacred text, because I was going to start off by apologizing for this being the point at the party where you regret inviting an English professor, because because watching Love is the Message most recently made me think about a book. Fancy that. But maybe you might think of it as like my sacred text. But it's also a sacred text, I think, of AJ's. We've talked about it before. It might be, if it's not his favorite book, certainly one of his favorite books, and that's Gene Toomer's Cain. And you could call Cain a novel, you could call Cain a collection of short stories, a collection of tone and prose poems. It's a thing that's, pretty indeterminate, both like AJ's work and if you know Gene Toomer, like Gene Toomer himself. So for all those who've read it, shout out to my students who I make read it every single year. It's a book in which the threat of lynching is ever present. I mean, it's a book that's haunted by that kind of violence. It's the threat of lynching, if not actual lynchings, are present on almost every page of the book. And every so often, as I said, that threat is realized, and one sees that horrible reality appear. But Cain also has a graphic design element, like that series of arcs that appears at the opening of each of its three sections, that never quite, that are themselves unfinished and indeterminate, as Thomas was saying, of AJ's work. These arcs that open up the three sections of Cain never come together to form a complete circle. And Toomer himself saw Cain as a kind of a loop. Oh, and there they are. Wonderful.
Show and tell. I just have the
believe me, this was not planned at all. But yeah, Toomer saw the book as a kind of loop, a circle that goes, it never quite forms itself. But the book itself goes from simple forms to complex forms, from poetry to prose, from the south to the north, and then back south again. So I think in the way that we now can encounter AJ's work on loop, makes me think that Love is the Message, and the Message is Death is even more like Cain than I might have thought before. But also, as we know more broadly, and as we've all been saying here, cycles of Black death and Black excellence have been playing out on a loop for years in front of our eyes, and that's something that it doesn't necessarily take AJ's work for us to see, but the fact that it does it so brilliantly, I think, is why I think it has special resonance now over this weekend.
Josh, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm so grateful for the invitation. Thank you to AJ and all of you. I really love this idea of a sacred text that you brought, Thomas. I think, I'm trying to think back to the first time I saw Love is the Message. I think it was at the Mocha in LA. And I went with my friend Merv, and we were sort of the only people in the gallery. And I just remember walking into this cavernous space and just being covered by the sound. And in thinking about what AJ has articulated about, Black cinema that has the power, beauty, and alienation of Black music, it felt like an actual entering into this cavernous space that sort of put me and took me out of time. We sat there and watched it a few times through on loop, and it felt like hours had gone by. So it actually really put me out of time in a moment. I also think that it is different. It plays differently in 2020 than it did in 2016 or 2017. And I think it's worth talking about that. I think, the 13 institutions that have come together to collectively stream this work in 13 different browser tabs, I think it's worth thinking about what those kinds of relationships are, particularly in this political moment. What does it mean for, in this moment of institutional reckoning, the kind of the ask to watch this film? What does that gesture mean? And also, what else are some of these institutions doing that can kind of meet the moment beyond just highlighting work? I also think, this film changed the way that I see. It changed the way that I make work. There's kind of a before and an after. It really is a sacred text in that way. And I also am thinking somewhat about some of Saidiya Hartman's work and her writing in Scenes of Subjection, thinking about this question, what does the exposure of the violated body yield? I think of that alongside what has happened in my timeline of the last 4 years. In some ways, I think AJ kind of anticipated the experience of autoplay and the sort of juxtaposition that happens when we're scrolling through our social media feeds, in his kind of the effective proximity of a grainy YouTube video, a moving image of Walter Scott's murder, and then Storyboard P from Khalil Joseph's beautiful film. And I just think that in some ways, the experience of being on social media and this film not being in the public domain and only sort of being able to approach it without another browser tab open is worth thinking about. I also think, sort of lastly, about an essay that Teju Cole wrote called Death in the Browser Tab, that's thinking about these moments of watching and witnessing, and something about, Saidiya Hartman, the uncertain line between witness and spectator. I hold that pretty closely, especially with, AJ talking about the microwave epiphany that a lot of white people have when they walk up to him and say, "I cried," and what else is being said in those kinds of gestures, I think are interesting to me.
I love what you've been saying, and there's a bunch of threads that I want to pull together. Which the thing that you just said at the end, Josh, is something that I experienced over and over again, which is, what does it mean for an audience member to be moved, right? And what does it mean for a white audience to be moved by a work like Love is the Message? And I have to say that I got really frustrated early on with, the immediate move to tears, right? Instead of doing the work, right, that this film demands of us. And so, it's something that both Thomas and Pete also said, talking about being entangled or ensnared by this film, right? To the point where you have to do something. And it's something that I feel like right now we are witnessing the relationship between, I've sort of talked about this before, the relationship between a response of empathy, being asked to, or feeling like you need to feel what other people are going through when you are not doing that, or to feel implicated, right, in what is happening. And I feel like that is one of the things that's going on in Love is the Message, is that those who want to go straight to the feeling without taking the responsibility of how we are entangled in these circumstances, how we entangled in the repetition of, right, of Black suffering, right? That there is a way that love is the message is putting us right in that space of untenability, right? Where you can't, you can't front. And so I guess that this, what this brings me to is that it's a second thing I want to talk about is Josh was also saying that this has been happening. Actually, all of you have been saying these encounters, these experiences have been happening within the private space of the gallery, right? But at the same time, it's a work of art that is pushing us to do these kinds of witnessing and these kinds of encounters. And so this is the other question. It's the question that Thomas is putting about, art in the moment, in the time of revolution, right? What is the role of Black art in this moment, right? What is the potential of Black art in this moment? There's the ongoing debate about art and politics or political art, right? I think this is different. And I would love to hear your insights and reflections on, this moment and what can Black art in particular do? Everybody's still muted.
We're thinking.
This is something that I hate about Zoom is like, I always tell my students, everybody unmute because we need ambient noise in the room. but you can stay muted. I'm not your teacher.
I mean, I don't need to go first again. I feel like I'm like just, out there. I probably should let myself cook a little bit more. But I mean, I think that that's a really great question. I think for me, like as a scholar, right? I think Black art has helped me learn how to live and live with other people, and has taught me to theorize, right? I think that like there's this tendency to think of art, and in particular Black art, as the object of study and the sort of the object of consumption, really, and less so what I think is really interesting, which is that art creates its own knowledge. It produces its own knowledge that we can learn from. And I think that whether explicitly political or not, Black art has always sort of modeled for us different ways of being in the world and being with others in the world. And so, I mean, I think that that's definitely something that AJ's work does, and that AJ's work not only has kind of made possible, but has documented already, right? That there's a historical practice of this, yeah. So, I mean, I think that like in terms of limits, right? I think this has been a big kind of industry boom, right? I think that like the infrastructure of the art world and again, the sort of conversion into private property is a limit. It does present a certain kind of limit. But I also think that, Thelonious Monk said something like, he didn't care if people copied him because, he was gonna have some new shit tomorrow. And, I think that speaks a lot to Black art in this particular moment where the market looms so large, and I also think it's changing. I think that, abolition is changing that. And I think Black art is gonna help us get there, right? It's gonna help us get to abolition. I think it already helps us to imagine differently and imagine more capaciously, for sure. So.
I really appreciate you saying that, Eliza, because I mean, I'm answering my own question, but I'm doing it provocatively, which is there's something about AJ's, theme, Black cinema with the power, beauty, and alienation of Black music. And where I think the power of Black art lies is in the alienation part, right? The power and the beauty, yes. But the alienation is what people often skip over, which is what does it mean for an artwork to put you outside, right? outside of your comfort zone, outside of yourself, to feel external, right? To transform. Again, it's not about like, I want you to identify with me. I want you to possibly feel or experience the kinds of alienation, right, that have been determinative and generative of Blackness, right, and Black culture. And that is a kind of potential that's untapped, right? And I think that that's also that moment when a lot of people are sort of emoting, right? But that is a form of displacement and alienation that's powerful. Elisa, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, but I think also maybe it's not about like, it's not just about how can I get you to also feel my alienation, but in a lot of ways, it's about actually alienating ourselves, right? And it's
yes,
about,
definitely. That's exactly what I meant. Yeah.
question is like, can we still make art that slips away, right? Can we still slip away? And I think that's the question for me, right? Is how do we continue to slip away and make a space for ourselves? And
Absolutely.
To pick up on the theme of alienation, to go back to your first question, Tina, just thinking about when I first encountered the work, so much of what was admirable and amazing and sort of shocking to one's core is how the work had an incredible amount of like unity, but also like this deep elusiveness to it that so much of what you saw on screen, like one shot couldn't be separated from the next. We were talking about connectivity before. And I think that's also where, to pick up on what Josh was saying, that, where, some of the pitfalls or limits might be in that there's one way of watching Love Is the Message where you only see, the beauty and excellence, where you only see the Steph Curry no-look passes, where that's the only thing that you take away, and you can have an emotive experience, whether it's one of whether it draws tears or laughter. But the point is that, like Birth of a Nation, for instance, is part of the same, cinematic lineage as Burt Williams, as Bradford Young, as AJ for that matter. And that, like, you can't take one away from the other, and all of the, you can't have one without the other. And those things are so intertwined. But also that's the beauty of the piece, is that at least one of the responses that it should engender, and not just AJ's piece, but Black art in general, is that one hopes that one would be inspired to take that next step and to figure out how to disentangle or to understand those particular connections. And especially that you can't have one without the other.
Josh, Thomas, you got anything to say? You want to add?
Yeah, just to continue, building and sharing and disagreeing. I mean, one thing I love about what you just said, Pete, it's like the way in which the forms of juxtaposition and montage of the various clips that Love Is the Message assembles creates a space of like being together, where things that like have no business being together somehow like make a certain kind of nonsense in relationship to one another, like nonsense as like a value that we might aspire to. And it feels like some of what this work to me, to kind of continue building with Elisa, like, it's a kind of like model for living, or like, a kind of like practice for what like forms of disorganization can mean together. And also a kind of acknowledgement like that this has existed already, like this is how we have cared for one another, and this is like how the history of creativity has been built, and also a kind of like promise to the future that we might continue to work in this kind of a way. I mean, I think the only other thing in terms of like Black art, the category of Black art, which I just want to like continue to amplify, I think, like the kind of cautionary tale that I hear in Elisa's comments, like that, the kind of ease with which this film screening in the way that it is doing without the kind of meaningful context that Tina, in the way that you're organizing this conversation, Athil and AJ in the prompt, Thelma, Legacy, Amanda, all the folks who came together to build this context. To me, those are not necessarily specific to art or the art world. I think the folks who came together believe in something under the banner of art, and can thus create this like shared space. But I think it's important to also, I guess, have other terms for what we're looking at. What I mean by that is like, you know, the thing that we're seeing is both in artwork and something else too. It's like, I think the taking of like discarded materials or rubble after riot and like assembling those in a certain way that like begins to build the world we want to live in. And to me, I feel like just situating this work within a history of Black artistic production, like work, you know, Noah Purifoy's, 66 Signs of Neon, which Kelly Jones has written about, which basically was an exhibition of artwork made from the rubble of the 65 Watts riots. Or moving forward in time, Lorna Simpson's Hypothetical from 1992 is a work that likewise responds to the physical material that came out of the Rodney King, the riots, again in Los Angeles and South Los Angeles. And to me, what those two works figure, and I think AJ is part of that kind of genealogy, is the way that like what is left over, like the garbage, like a little garbage, what would be thrown away, actually becomes the building blocks for the kind of world in which we want to live. And any version of Black art that doesn't attend to that, that like tries to, I think proclaim the like genius of this work so that it can like fit within a certain kind of teleology or genealogy of like the inclusion of Black artists within a canon, is a travestying of the kind of potential and energy and life, which we just know like won't happen because we won't let it happen. But it's just exciting to be in this mode where we can actually see those folks who are caring for this work and building context for this work actually creating this as both an artwork and something else, like maybe a social service, or providing a kind of functional need to move with one another that we're craving in this moment.
I love the idea of like thinking across media too, right? It's thinking about how Noah Purifoy's work and AJ's work, right, are doing the same architectural work, right? They're doing the same sort of like work, even though we have these kind of arbitrary distinctions between media and also I think the way that Pete, that you've invoked Kane, for example, right? I think thinking across media is like, that is sort of Black cultural practice to begin with, right? And Thomas, when you said sort of this idea of things that have no business being together, right? That is knowledge production, right? Like that is like a way of working and a way of thinking, is saying, okay, like we've been taught to think about things in a certain way, they have a certain order, there's a way you think about things, right? And then this sort of logic of the nonsense, right? The kind of, it opens up a completely different methodology for us to like live in and move towards. So like, yeah, I really, really like that.
I also just want to briefly build on what you're saying, Thomas, because I think it's so important, and also speak to your question, Tina, about Black art, and specifically right now. I feel like I can't remember a time, thinking of the sort of post-pandemic rebellion of 2020, that felt more animated by Black art. I think that there were moments a couple of weeks ago when people started burning police cars, that I felt like I was watching the end of Jatavia Gary's An Ecstatic Experience. I felt like this work is so present in the kind of movement work that's happening right now. It's not lost on me that this past weekend for Juneteenth, for like the 619 convenings in 650 different actions and across many cities, that what ended up being the 2-day live stream was run by essentially the Black Star Film Festival. That Maori Holmes was one of the people that stepped in and situated short films and art films alongside live streams from some of these gatherings, and really wonderful conversations. And I just think that there's something that feels very braided and very closely intertwined about both the art world and sort of a movement space that I can't remember seeing personally.
Mm-hmm.
I also think one more thing that that I heard you say, Tina, in a conversation, one of these Zoom conversations a few days ago, is that you were thinking about the rebellion and rebellion as wake work and a way to honor and grieve the dead. And I think that it's so present in some of, we see these many videos from the streets, and we hear the same songs in different cities, right? We hear Pop Smoke's Dior in like 5 different places within New York. And they feel like a connective tissue, a sort of constellational relationship between many of these gatherings that we're also seeing in our feed. So I just wonder maybe if you could speak to this question of rebellion as wake work as well.
Yeah, I mean, for me, these protests are a way of not letting those who are taken from us be taken in vain, right? So what does it mean to say a name over and over again, to sort of say George Floyd's name and to insist that the powers that be say that name, right? So to keep that name in our mouths, so to speak, right? And that protest is always about connecting our future with our past and not letting our past be ripped from us, right? And so that to me is really, really important. And so one of the things that I'm most struck by in terms of the protest is the sound of them, right? I mean, I'm away, but I've been all of the all of the video that I'm looking at, I'm actually much more attuned to what I'm hearing than what I'm seeing, because there's a way in which that, like, sort of the chants, the chants that are dialogues, the call and response of them, right? And when that call and response is about bringing somebody here, right, who has been taken from us too soon, right? And insisting on the accountability through that naming, through that chanting, and through the chanting as a dialogue amongst ourselves, right? That to me it just undoes me, right? And even like the sort of the more sort of less personal chanting of, this is what democracy looks like, right? In this moment in time is really powerful when we have a fascist, running our country. So, to really say, to ask the question, what does it look like? And to name the fact that what you are doing is what it is, right? Is to actually claim the space, and to claim the space, not just for you, but for, your kids and for the people who died to get you here. And that is also the power of this movement. I mean, we were talking before we went live, and Eliza, I was talking about bicycle protests that my goddaughter was showing me. And Eliza was talking about, there's an extraordinary amount of organization that is happening around these protests that is not seen. Right. And I was saying there's an extraordinary amount of improvisational organization that is happening that we see and we don't see. But, I've been saying this over and over again, is that, activists have been in training for this moment, right? They've been training for this moment. So it's not a moment of, oh, we want this, but we don't know what it's going to look like. It's a moment of, I can write this down for you. I can write out step by step where we're supposed to be going and how we're supposed to get here. And that is what, to me, this moment is about. And when all of you are talking about, your response to what is the role of Black art in this moment, I absolutely agree with you, Eliza. Black art is the power to imagine beyond what we can see. Right? Beyond any model that we've already been given. It is the capacity to see the impossible. And because art doesn't have the limitations of proving something, it has the capacity to make us see differently and to see each other differently. so I'm sorry, I'm answering my other question again, but this is a conversation. One thing I'm supposed to say, I got a text from Ethiel, which is that if folks who are watching this would like to pose a question, we've only got like 15 minutes, but you can send in questions to info@sunhaus.us, info@sunhaus.us. And Theo will bounce them over to us. Yeah, so I mean, I want to come back to one other point that was raised, which kind of is in the middle of this tangle of ideas we've been thinking about. And it's a word, I can't remember who used it, but institutional reckoning, right? That, we're seeing that all over the place, the ways some of them are lip service and some of them are more effortful kinds of reckonings. But, the institutional reckoning in the art world, what might that look like in a meaningful way? Because I think it's something we need to also put on the table, is that the way in which there's certain accountability being demanded and recognition being demanded, the response has to be not institutional lip service, but institutional reckoning. And so I'm curious what that might look like, or how we might start to envision that.
I think one thing, and Josh, I know you think about this, but like one thing that seems really basic is like thinking about objects that have been stolen by museums and like some sort of repatriation or acknowledgement or something, right? To that takes seriously how deeply a lot of these institutions have been built on looting, ironically, right? So I think that's one very like basic pragmatic thing that could be on the table.
Tough question, right?
I live for this line of questioning. I feel like this is like.
I was about to call on you, Tom Slacks.
No, one thing that's exciting is it feels like for some an impossibility, because like the lip service co-ops so easily so many of the demands, alternatives, dream worlds in which we are already living, and at the same time we already everywhere around us have modes of not necessarily redress, because I don't know if that's even possible, but at least modes of like accounting amongst ourselves, and it feels like even just this model of what it is for 13 museums and institutions to come together across the world to say, we believe so deeply in not only this artwork or this artist, but the kind of assembly that made this possible and that continues to make this possible, that we're going to get over our kind of individual institutional egos and competitions, and even the category of property, to go back, I think, to an early point Elisa made, that like, what this proposes is like a mode of care that does not rely on acquisition, collecting, accessioning, the kinds of fundamental ways in which, like looting makes sense only as far as like the category of like a unique object of property exists. And so how to kind of take the prompt of us coming together, that we can care by not owning things, which is actually not a form of care, but we can care by actually collaborating and working together, and in that process destroy the category of property. And it feels like that is what, if I was writing about that like 2 months ago, people might have looked at me sideways, but now it feels like if that is not at the very least on the table as like a first horizon, then we're perpetuating a certain kind of anti-Black work under the guise of Blackness, which, I think, just requires us to think about capital and Blackness as just inextricably linked, things that the traditions out of which we come have done. But if we are to live and exist within the context of an art world, this is the moment, I think, to take the knowledges and practices that we've developed and amplify them.
And maybe we could the art world. Maybe art could be the world, maybe we could melt it down. to its
I mean,
part.
what I was going to say was it's connected to that, which is what if we thought about art as not an object, right? If it's not an object, then, then all of this other logic does not work, right? And I sort of feel like that's part of what the live streaming of Love is a Message is. It's like, this is not an object, right? And one of the things that, the responses proved is that it's more than an object, right? And that art should be thought of as having lives, right? And having life worlds that circulate and that generate other life worlds and other visions and other dreams. And so to actually think about art beyond the object, right? Beyond the object of acquisition or object of consumption is another way of thinking about institutional reckoning in the art world.
And maybe also thinking beyond the particular vocabularies that we invoke. I mean, especially with regard to Black art made by Black people, and thinking about terms that we were saying about property, about collecting, about owning, about acquisition or requisition, looting, thinking about the history of all of these particular terms, especially with regard to things or people that were once regarded as objects or property.
I think this has me thinking a little bit about Cameron Rowland's work actually right now, thinking about sort of contracts as kind of the occasion for 13 museums coming together, right? I imagine that AJ wouldn't have put this online maybe out of respect to some of these contracts. And so the idea that he's perhaps convening these museums to all kind of violate their contracts at the same time by broadcasting it in a way where it may be ripped or downloaded by someone in the process. It just has me thinking about the way that Cameron Rowland thinks about contracts and what it means to allow someone to buy your work or not.
And to evacuate property value.
Mm-hmm.
Think not just about how can I redistribute this value towards myself, but how can I abolish value, right? Abolish the property value, which I think is what his work is doing so brilliantly. So yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I just got a question that's really interesting from one of the viewers. Two questions, at least. How do you see the impact of Arthur Jafa's work on potentially connecting an intergenerational audience through his threading of historic and current imagery with popular music? How might this inform the work of activating intergenerational activism and communication? Which I think is a fabulous question, right? Which goes back to the then and the now, right? Which goes to how do we speak across generational models of doing the kind of work of reimagination that we're doing. I mean, Josh, I think you've been thinking about this, and Pete also as well. Go ahead.
I talked over you at the beginning. So I feel like I should let you go.
No. Go ahead. Oh, so Josh, we'll have you first.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think the place that I go first in my mind is thinking about the kinds of, just thinking intergenerationally, the kinds of media that were present when AJ made this work, right? This is still a moment when Vine exists as a social media service. I think that there's been a lot that has shifted in the last 4 years that I think in some ways AJ's work kind of anticipates or is ahead of, in terms of the consolidation of the media ecosystem and sort of what he is pulling from in his found footage. And I think that in as much as the way that AJ has taught many of us to see differently or to look differently can animate a certain generation of younger people in both their calls for abolition and also the kind of visual work that's being made as a part of the broader work of transforming this society. I think that absolutely it has that kind of power. And I'm thinking again specifically about artists like Jatavia Gary, for instance. I think she's really thinking about many of these questions. Yeah, sorry, Pete, I'll let you go now.
No. I feel to pick up on one thing that Lisa was saying in terms of evacuating the the value from works of art. I think to a certain extent now that, love is the message can and will and more than likely probably will be shared, much more widely, not beyond the bounds of even this weekend. Now that it's part of popular culture, I sort of feel, in terms of thinking about generational difference, I feel comfortable making what is, I suppose, now a really dated cultural reference, in that, and I feel like no one should, or at least feel as if they can watch Love is the Message and download Blackness, perhaps in the way that, or the Black experience in the way that Neo does as easily in The Matrix. And that, to me, there's nothing simplistic about this work beyond the fact that it's 7 minutes and it can take you to watch. And, it's a work that tries, on the other hand, to layer the complexities of the Black experience, of being Black, and tries to represent it, or to at least attempt to represent it. Apologies for the siren. But the same, I think but it also exists that, there are also Black folk out there who don't see everything, perhaps, that there is to see in the work. Blackness is not, a particular monolith. And that's, something that I think is also present in this particular work, and I think in Black art in general. But I think, to get back to the notion of, bridging, I suppose, like intergenerational gaps. One of the things that I think that that's hard to see maybe about AJ's work is how technical it is. And this is getting back to, I think, what Josh was saying, or a bit of what Josh was talking about, in terms of how it has maybe the potential to influence those who come later, in terms of, the actual particular technical things that AJ is doing with frame rates, and not just in how he's juxtaposing different clips together, but what he's doing with those particular clips, and what it is, how he's able to get your eye to look not just at Obama giving a eulogy for Clement and Pinckney, but to look behind him and to see the inspiration of, I don't know, you should go back, once you're done with this, you should go back and just watch the dude who's behind Obama, who has the sunglasses on, takes them off when he understands what Obama is about to do in terms of singing Amazing Grace. Like what AJ is able to do with film that allows you to see something like that. It's a metaphor, just one, in terms of trying to get you to see, beneath the surface level of Blackness, of a particular video clip, of an image, to try to get you to see behind, or underneath the image, in a way. And I think that is a way forward in terms of something that, perhaps younger folk who are encountering AJ's work, maybe even for the first time, can take forward.
So we are exactly at 2:59, which means that as soon as I'm finished, we'll be at 3. and so in order to, preserve everything that has been said, I mean, I think it's a really great place to end, to think about, to actually acknowledge the ways in which different generations may be encountering this work and the different things that they're getting from it. So that kind of multiplicity and polyphony of a piece like Love is the Message is Death, is what is being made available now in this 48 hours of wall-to-wall Love is the Message. I want to thank everybody for participating and all the wonderful contributions. I also want to plug the fact that we're going to have a second panel tomorrow at the same bat time on the same bat channel right here, 2:00 Eastern Standard Time. And our participants tomorrow will be Arya Dean, Rashad Newsom, Isis Pickens, and Simone White. And I'm really looking forward to having that conversation as well. So thanks to everyone, and I will see you all around. Take care.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tina. So good to be with everybody.
So good to see y'all. Bye.
Thanks, Tina. Bye.